Jane Sommers, Murder at the Vanderbilt Estate. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Gathering. Mrs. Vanderbilt's house, surrounded by dense forest, looked especially grim on this overcast day. The grandchildren were gathering in the living room, each entering the house with their thoughts and hopes. The first to arrive was Michael. A tall, slender man with a confident demeanor, he had always been an ambitious businessman. Michael entered the house and immediately headed to the living room, studying the surroundings. He nervously tapped his fingers on the table, waiting for the others. Sarah, an eccentric artist with long red hair, followed next. Her bright clothes and free-spirited manner immediately caught attention. She stopped to examine a family portrait on the wall, while her hands mechanically drew something in the air. John, an introverted physicist, arrived a little later. His gray hair and glasses gave him the look of an eternal student. He silently took a corner in the living room with a book, clearly ignoring what was happening around him. Laura, a glamorous model with perfect makeup and stylish clothes, was the last of the grandchildren to arrive. Her manners were impeccable, and without wasting time, she approached a mirror to adjust her makeup. Paul, a musician with tousled hair and a constant smile on his face, hugged everyone and began quietly humming something to himself. Paul was particularly close to his grandmother. He often visited her, helped around the house, and played the guitar for her. His cheerful character and kindness made him a family favorite. Emily, a young mother of two, entered last. She looked tired but tried to remain calm despite the hustle and bustle around her. Her children tugged at her dress, asking for attention. Lawyer Anna Blackwood, a cold and precise woman in her 40s, entered the living room holding a thick folder. Her stern look and confident movements silenced everyone. "Dear heirs," she began, "I have been entrusted with reading the will of your grandmother, Mrs. Vanderbilt, in an hour. Please prepare yourselves. We will start promptly at 6 p.m. After this announcement, a tense silence fell over the living room. The grandchildren began to disperse. Michael headed to the phone to make an important call, Sarah went outside to smoke, John continued reading his book, and Laura and Emily went to the bathroom to freshen up. Time passed slowly, and the tension grew. When it was time to gather in the room, Paul was missing. Sarah volunteered to look for him. "I'll find him. He's probably lost in thought again," Sarah said, leaving the living room. A few minutes later, a scream broke the silence. Sarah ran out of the bathroom, pale and trembling. "Paul, he's dead," she screamed. Everyone, including Anna, ran from the living room to the bathroom. Paul lay on the floor, strangled with a guitar string. Anna immediately called the police. A little later, Detective Jane Sommers knocked on the door. She quickly assessed the situation, learning the details from Anna. "No one leaves this house," Jane said. "We need to find out what happened here." Jane knew it would be a long and challenging day. All the suspects were here, and any one of them could be the killer. Chapter 2. Murder and Disappearance. Detective Jane Sommers carefully examined the crime scene. Paul lay on the bathroom floor, strangled with a guitar string. Everyone in the house was a potential suspect, and each looked disturbed. "I want everyone to stay within sight," Jane said, and everyone nodded, although their faces showed displeasure. Jane began to search the house, looking for clues that might help with the investigation. She found several interesting leads: a torn piece of paper by the fireplace and the smell of tobacco in the room where Sarah had smoked. The detective returned to the living room and looked over all the gathered people again. "All right, let's start with you, Michael. Where were you when Paul disappeared?" Jane asked. "I was calling my lawyer," Michael replied, avoiding her gaze. "Don't you find it strange that Paul disappeared at that moment?" Jane continued. "Of course I do, but there was nothing I could do," Michael shrugged. Jane moved on to the next suspect. "Sarah, what were you doing?" "I was smoking outside. I had my sketchbook with me and was making some drawings," Sarah replied, not looking at the detective. "John, did you notice anything?" Jane asked. "No, I was engrossed in my book. I didn't see or hear anything," John calmly replied. "Laura, you said you were in the bathroom. Can you confirm that?" Jane asked. "Yes, I was checking my makeup," Laura replied with irritation in her voice. "Emily, did your children notice anything?" Jane asked the last suspect. "No, they didn't understand anything. I was trying to calm them down," Emily replied, holding her children close. Jane turned her attention to Henry, the butler, who was standing aside, attentively watching everyone. "Henry, where were you?" she asked. "I was in the kitchen making tea," he replied with dignity. "So we have 6 grandchildren, the butler, and the lawyer. Someone among you killed Paul and stole the will. Each of you had a motive," Jane said, looking at each one in turn. "But who?" she asked loudly, hoping someone would crack under the pressure. Chapter 3. Locked Doors. Night gradually enveloped the house. Jane ordered all doors and windows to be locked so no one could leave. She began a thorough investigation, examining every corner. Meanwhile, Henry prepared tea for everyone. He had been a loyal servant to the family for years, but Jane knew that even the most devoted could have their secrets. The detective decided to question each suspect individually. She started with Michael. "Michael, tell me about your relationship with Paul," Jane asked, closing the office door. "We didn't get along. Paul was irresponsible. He never worked and constantly took money from our grandmother," Michael replied, crossing his arms. "Could you have killed him for the money?" Jane asked directly. "No, I'm not a killer. I have my own company and don't need my grandmother's money," Michael replied, clearly nervous. Jane knew that any of them could be lying. She continued the interrogation with Sarah. "Sarah, what can you tell me about Paul?" "He was sweet but sometimes annoying with his carefree attitude. We weren't close, but I couldn't kill him," Sarah replied, playing with the ring on her finger. Each interrogation revealed new details but provided no clear answers. John, Laura, and Emily also denied their guilt, but their answers were full of contradictions and omissions. Jane knew someone was lying. But who? Chapter 4. The First Interrogations. The next day, Jane continued her investigation. She once again examined the crime scene and noticed the torn piece of paper by the fireplace. The detective approached Anna Blackwood. "Anna, what can you tell me about the will?" Jane asked. "It was a detailed will. Mrs. Vanderbilt distributed her estate among all the grandchildren, but the main part of the inheritance was supposed to be the house," Anna replied, holding a folder with documents. "To whom was the house supposed to go?" Jane asked. "That was the main intrigue of the will. Mrs. Vanderbilt didn't reveal it until the end," Anna replied. Jane realized that the will could be the motive for the murder. Someone knew that the house might not go to them and decided to eliminate the competitor. "I will continue the interrogations. We need to find the killer and retrieve the will," Jane said, leaving the room. There were more questions than answers, but Detective Sommers knew that every little discovery brought her closer to the truth. Chapter 5. False Leads. As the interrogations continued, Jane began to notice that many of the grandchildren were inconsistent in their testimonies. For example, Michael first said he was calling his lawyer, then that he was checking his mail. Jane decided to verify the alibis of each suspect. She asked Henry to help gather everyone in the living room. "We will now verify each of your alibis. Michael, let's start with you. Show us who you called," Jane said. Michael tried to hide his phone but under pressure admitted that he had called his lawyer about his financial problems. "Why are you lying, Michael?" Jane asked. "I didn't want you to know about my problems," Michael replied, blushing. Sarah, John, Laura, and Emily also began to get tangled in their testimonies. Each of them had a motive, but there was no direct evidence. Jane knew the killer was among them. She decided to set a trap. Chapter 6. Sudden Revelations. Jane asked everyone to gather for dinner and began a conversation on unrelated topics. During the conversation, she carefully watched the reactions of each suspect. Suddenly Laura, unable to bear the tension, dropped her fork and exclaimed, "I knew this would happen. Paul was always a threat to all of us." "What do you mean, Laura?" Jane calmly asked. Laura fell silent, realizing she had said too much. "Continue, Laura," Jane insisted. "Paul knew something about each of us. He blackmailed me, Michael, and Sarah," Laura confessed. It became clear that each of the grandchildren had a serious motive. Chapter 7. The Key to the Mystery. Jane decided to conduct a more detailed search of Paul's room. In his room, she found a diary in which Paul recorded his thoughts and the secrets of others. These records could be the key to the mystery, Jane thought, opening the diary. In the diary, Paul described his relationships with each of the grandchildren. He knew about Michael's financial problems, Sarah's failed career, and the questionable dealings of John and Laura. But most interestingly, at the end of the diary, Paul wrote about his plan to get the entire inheritance. I knew Paul was cunning, but I didn't think he would go this far, Jane thought, closing the diary. She decided it was time for the final confrontation. Chapter 8. The Real Killer. Jane gathered everyone in the living room and began to reveal the evidence she had found. Paul blackmailed many of you. He knew your secrets and used them against you. But someone decided to put an end to this, Jane began. She looked at each of the suspects. Laura nervously fidgeted, Michael avoided her gaze, Sarah quietly cried, John was lost in thought, and Emily clung to her children. The real killer is among you. It's the one who knew the will could take everything away. Someone who didn't want the truth to come out, Jane continued, looking intently at Michael. Michael turned pale, realizing Jane knew something. You found Paul's diary, didn't you, Michael? Jane continued. You went into his room to find something to calm you down and stumbled upon his diary and the will. Michael, trembling, began to speak. Yes, it's true. I was in a terrible state, nervous about the whole situation. I knew Paul might have something to help me calm down. A bit of marijuana. I started looking in his room and found the diary and the will hidden in his shelf. All eyes were on Michael. He continued. I found out that Paul wasn't just visiting our grandmother out of love. He was trying to convince her to make him the sole heir. He stole the will and wanted to rewrite it in his favor. Jane nodded, confirming her suspicions. You realized Paul wasn't just a sweet and caring grandson. He was a cunning manipulator planning to fraudulently get the entire inheritance. Yes, Michael said, tears streaming down his face. At that moment, Paul entered the room. He saw me with his diary and the will. We started arguing, and he attacked me, trying to kill me to keep his plans secret. With difficulty, Michael continued. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed the guitar string lying under his bed and started defending myself. It was accidental. I didn't mean to kill him. But in the struggle, I strangled him. Everyone in the room froze, realizing the truth. Jane stepped forward and placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. After that, you tried to revive Paul, took him to the bathroom to wash his face, but he was already dead. Michael, sobbing, nodded. Yes, I tried to save him, but it was too late. Jane called the police to arrest Michael. Everyone present was in shock, realizing that Michael had acted in panic and desperation. Chapter 9. The Inheritance. After Michael's arrest, the will was found in his room. It turned out that Mrs. Vanderbilt had left her house to the butler, Henry, who had cared for her for many years. I didn't expect this, Henry said, tears rolling down his cheeks. I was just doing my job. You deserve it, Henry, Jane said, shaking his hand. The grandchildren were in shock, but no one disputed Mrs. Vanderbilt's decision. The story ended, but Jane knew this was just one of many cases she would face. Her work continued, and she was ready for new challenges. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.